At this point, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Duncan P. McKinnon. He is the director of the Jamie C. Brandon Center for Archaeological Research and an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Central Arkansas. He has multiple publications, including chapters in the archaeology of Caddo, historical archaeology of Arkansas, a hidden diversity, and reconsidering Mississippian households and communities. He has several chapters and is a co-editor of Archaeological Remote Sensing in North America, Innovative Techniques for Anthropological Applications, and the list goes on. He's also helping me very much to put together the annual meeting, which will be at the end of September. And you can find that information on the Society's website. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Duncan McKinnon. And the title of his talk is The Use of Historical Images to Evaluate Archaeological Landscapes.
Okay, well, thank you, Marilyn. Let me share the screen here and pull up the slide. All right, I'm assuming everyone can see the title slide. We good to go? All right. Oops. Clicking around here. Okay, I need to make sure I can see it too. All right. So it's good to see some familiar faces and some new faces, certainly. I'm always glad to give talks to society meetings. I've given talks to chapters before in person. This is a new way of doing it, which is great. I've been doing it for a year, this format at least. So here we go. So this is going to be, as Marilyn mentioned, we're going to talk about the use of historical images to evaluate archaeological landscapes. So it's going to be kind of a picture show, if you will, and looking at how the use of historical images can be used to inform on interpretations of landscape and landscape change at different scales. Oops. So to begin, I thought it would be fruitful and worthwhile to consider a couple terms to provide some context to this talk. And the first is the term historical, and more specifically as it relates to historical archaeology or archaeology more generally. The Society for Historic Archaeology, the Society for Historical Archaeology defines historical archaeology as the study of the material remains of past societies that also left behind some other form of historical evidence. So then, what defines past society? One way we can evaluate this is through a comparison of changes in form and application of different types of technology. Certainly societies in the distant past invented, produced, utilized different forms of technologies, things like technologies associated with processing raw materials and weaving those into textiles. Technologies associated with tending to land and animal resources, things like stone tool technology. These societies also use technologies associated with image making. So ceramic production and the images and the designs that contain meaning that were applied to those ceramics, or forms of non-portable art. And of course, many of you are aware that Arkansas contains numerous examples of image making in the form of rock art. So these and many other forms of technology define past society. So broadly then, the term historical, we might say, simply refers to something that is of the past and not of the present. And in that light, these material remains are certainly historical in nature. and images on ceramics and on the walls and ceilings of rock art. Thus, they're documentary forms of evidence of past societies, but they're not considered historical evidence per this definition by the Society for Historical Archaeology. This is because largely the shapes and the patterns are often not accompanied with written descriptions of their meanings. They are of greater antiquity and not usually the subject of the discipline of historical archaeology. So then that leads to this next term. What is historical evidence? Let's move a little bit closer in time and consider the process of image making. Is a picture taken 70 years ago considered historical evidence of a past society? It certainly is if we frame this around technology. As I've got shown here on the slide, this image of local diggers at the Bowman site, and I'll talk more about Bowman here in a little bit, in 1949, setting up their large and cumbersome tripod camera, not digital, by the way, okay? But can 20, 10, 5, even last year, images taken during those times, can they be considered historical evidence of a past society? And of course, we can look to social media and we can say, well, like Facebook Memories considers images from previous years documentary evidence of the past, and or we can look at the hashtag Throwback Thursday and those kinds of things. And so I want to kind of pose a question to ponder as we work through these images, and I'll revisit it at the end of this talk, is that if we share these images through the technologies that we have today from the past, do they again become part of the present and then are embodied with new meanings, right? As they're kind of reinvented and reintroduced in a continuous way. So we'll think about that as we work through this. But so we can say, though, that past societies can be evaluated based on a change in the form and application of types of technology, such as how images are created and how images are shared. So all of this to say that what I refer to as historical images need not be of deep antiquity and can be used to evaluate archaeological landscapes. And these images thus are a form of historical evidence acquired by a past society. And of course, that society, as I alluded to, could be 10, 20, 30 years ago. And when we consider all forms of historical evidence in these forms of image making and so forth, there's multiple layers at play here. First is the individual who made the image and the time period in which it was made, okay? So this is historical evidence of image making that represents one particular society, okay? So is it these guys here taking a photograph of something? Or is it individuals creating rock art that's depicting something of that time, okay? Second is the subject matter. In archaeological images, this is often documenting a second and earlier past society. So it's multi-layered in terms of its temporal sequence. And these layers document archaeological landscapes and the former lived landscapes that span thus and connect these historical evidence over time, over centuries, okay? So technically speaking, a photograph is made by the chemical process of the transformation of silver halide grains by light onto a roll of film, okay? An image is a graphic made by a non-photographic process, such as the collection of pixels produced by some sort of computer sensor, okay? So a photograph can be made into an image, okay? An image can't be made into a photograph. So a photograph can be made into an image by using a scanning sensor to create a pattern of digital pixels, okay? And when this is done, these former photographs, now referred to as images, allow for manipulation. You can scale them, you can zoom in, you can do all kinds of different color manipulations to tease out information, right? And importantly, they can be shared and integrated with other images. Maybe those are images that have been scanned, former photographs that have been scanned of aerial imagery, that, or maybe they're more contemporaneous photographs, more recent photographs and images. Okay. So for archaeological purposes, there's essentially three scales. The first is aerial imagery. Of course, this is taken from above the landscape, either with the camera mounted in a vertical position, so taken directly down on the landscape, or oblique, taken forward at some angle. A second is what I refer to as terrestrial images. These are taken from the ground surface, either looking across the landscape in a plan view, okay, or maybe from looking outward from the top of a landform down into a valley or something like that. So also oblique as well. And the third is the use of imagery to document material objects, often taken when these objects were first inventoried 50, 60, 70 or so years ago, okay? Now in this talk, and in the interest of time, I'm just gonna focus on aerial imagery and terrestrial images, but I just wanted to take a second here and provide a little anecdotal kind of example of the use of historical artifact documentation. Several years ago, I was invited by Jamie Brandon, who was the station archaeologist at SAU in Magnolia at the time. He invited me to come down and to present a paper on Caddo ceramics and a specific design motif or design element on certain Caddo ceramics to the Caddo Hidachu chapter, which is now the Red River chapter. So I drove all the way down there. I might have been living in Fayetteville at the time. So I drove all the way down there. I think I was. And a few hours before the meeting, it was realized that a small display of actual Caddo ceramics would be beneficial and productive, so the audience could see these designs in real form, so to speak, as opposed to in two-dimensional on the screen. So we only had about an hour before the talk was going to start, so we rummaged through all these boxes, opening, trying to, just randomly trying to find something that we could use. We weren't successful, so we just chalked it up to, okay, well, we'll scrap that idea and move on. Okay, we're looking for this design that I referred to as a rayed circle design. Okay, but as we were walking out the door to go to the meeting, Dr. Brandon recognized a small Hempstead engraved bottle that was sitting on a table with a bunch of other bottles. It was kind of mixed in there. And they were only there because art students, SAU art students, had come earlier in the day, and Dr. Brandon was giving a lecture on art and ceramics to these students. So the bottle is pictured there on the left, okay? Color image on the left, the physical bottle that we used. It had been accessioned, the only notes on it, it had been accessioned in 1995. So we go grab the bottle, we go to the lecture hall. And a few slides into my presentation, I show some images on the screen to show the variation in design of this rayed circle. And these were historical images taken in the 60s and 70s and 80s and so forth, and had been recently scanned and digitized. So included with these images was this one on the right-hand side. Okay, can you all see my mouse moving, my cursor? Okay, good. It's a small Hempstead engraved bottle. Okay, it had been the notes on it. Anybody at the survey knows the orange cards, and they have the notes scribbled on them. And so the notes on the card said that it had been photographed in 1971 and recorded at that time as having been collected and documented from a known site in Columbia County. Okay. So the slide comes up, the image comes up, and all of a sudden we realized, as well as audience members, that there was a similarity in size between the two. There was a similarity in the rayed circle design, okay? But they also contain a distinct arrangement of these fire clouds, these dark spots, which is associated with the firing process, these fire clouds, okay? So they're random. And so the randomness and the similarity between these two enabled us to determine that the bottle that we had gathered when we walked out the door, an unprovenious bottle, was the same bottle that was pictured on the slide. Okay. So we have an historical artifact image from 1971 from a private collection where site information was known. At some point, who knows what happened? Maybe it changed collector hands or something like that, but the provenience was lost. The vessel was then donated to SAU Research Station in somewhere in the early 90s. It was accessioned in 1995 with no provenience. And then through this process of using historical imagery, and granted it was haphazard, it was finally reassigned its provenience through the use of this historic artifact image. So just an anecdotal example of the application of that, okay? All right, so we're gonna move on to aerial and terrestrial images, and I'm gonna do this by presenting three case studies, or case sites, okay? The first is the Bowman site. It's located along the Red River in the southwest corner of the state. You can see the red dot there. It is it has been documented as a large multi-mound site with at least 8 mounds, perhaps more, that dates to, it needs a lot more work, but it presumably dates its early to middle Caddo, beginning, somewhere AD 1000 or so. Okay. But in the 1940s and 1960s, there was a lot of digging by local amateurs at the site. And during those activities, photographs were taken of many of the landscape features, including the mounds, as well as numerous sketches and maps. Some are better than others, okay, but they're there, okay. So anecdotally, there is a general expectation that the site has been disturbed quite heavily over the years as a result of agricultural production, and access to the site has not been available for many years. So when I began pulling together information, I had 2 primary questions that I hoped historical imagery could address. So broadly, I wanted to understand the integrity of the site over time. So essentially, what kinds or what types of historical land use are evident at the site, and how might they have impacted these mounds, these 8 or more mounds? Have the mounds been plowed down? And if so, where were they formerly located? So we can understand the distribution and arrangement of the site. Okay. Additionally, I was interested in understanding if there were any evidence of tenant farming occupations, which is quite common along these Red River sites. And so obviously, if there was tenant farming occupation of the site, that would have added an additional archaeological layer, if you will, to this landscape usage that I was interested in understanding. Okay, so the first documented digging is with a gentleman by the name of Pete Muir. His work at the site dates to the late 1940s and early 1950s. He and others were active collectors. He was based out of Texarkana, and he and others, as I said, dug at numerous sites throughout the Red River region. And, he often kept fairly good records and diagrams and inventories. I mean, all relative to how we would look at them today, of course. They're fairly esoteric in the inventories, and sometimes they're very difficult to understand. But nonetheless, all things considered, he took pretty good notes and records and diagrams and so forth. For example, he commissioned a map of the site in 1950 that's pictured here that I digitized. It documents the location of the mounds at the time. So you can see that here's a mound with the central mound group. We've got some wooded areas around to the outside, some mounds kind of on the periphery. And then he also documented these large, what he refers to as cemetery areas, and he kind of generally calls them by some general pottery names and so forth. But these are areas that he dug as well. Later in the 1960s, additional local Texas-based collectors received permission to dig at the site, more specifically to dig these 2 mounds, Mound 1 and Mound 2. And from these efforts, they sketched profile maps of their excavations. They took a lot of photos and sketched a lot of the stuff that they dug. So I'm working through all those and digitizing those to get a better understanding of the chronology of the site and the chronology of the mound building and so forth. But a valuable resource that is available is a series of photographs that were taken between over the course of about 25 years, between 1949 and 1974. And I'm going to kind of look at the photographs on the bookends of those, 1949 and 1974, just in the interest of time. So in 1949, Muir took these landscape photos. He recorded the orientation of the view of each photo at several different positions that I've lettered. Okay. And so the first one I call position A. Mound 1, as labeled there, is viewed looking south from the center of the mound group. And in the photograph, you can see a tenant building, a tenant, presumably the household, farmstead on top of the mound. Okay. There's some outbuildings down here on the bottom. Okay. And then you can see a fence line that's running along the mound here towards mound 2. And I've sketched that in here with this dotted line. That's that fence line there. Okay. He then, from the same position, seemingly rotated the tripod 180 degrees and took a photograph of mound 4 looking to the north. And the mound is covered in trees. Okay. Cattle can be seen on the east and the west behind the mound, and it's a little hard to see, but there's another fence line that's running back there in the distance. Okay. And that's this one here that I've marked on the north side. He also took 2 photos from what I call position B. So he's taking a picture of mound 2 looking south from within the central mound group because there's no fences in the foreground. Mound 2 has this rounded profile. It's real low. There's no trees on it. And then mound 1 is visible off to the side. We know it's mound 1 because it has evidence of the tenant building on top of it. Okay. There's a field fence that runs behind these mounds, and you can see all the cows clustered behind that field fence. It kind of runs right along here behind this mound and off to the other side. Okay. And seemingly from the same position, he rotates his tripod to the south east towards mound 3, this one up here. And so we have, some up close shots of some cows and mound 3, this low relief and this cluster of trees behind it. And in his notes, he says behind the cluster of trees it says quote, borrow pit in trees behind mound. Well, that's this large borrow pit that was drawn in the 1950 map. Okay. So he took a photograph from position C looking south. It's taken north of the field fence because you can see this fence running all the way along and the cows on the other side of it. And you can see mounds 3, 2, 1, and 4 running across. Okay. And then he moved over inside the fenced-in area and took a photograph of mound 4 from the other side, looking south. There's no fence visible in the foreground, so the assumption is he's, again, within that fenced-in area. Now, position E is a little more difficult to ascertain, or at least this particular photo, but I presume that he is outside the area here. It is a south view, and you can, there's no evidence of fences and so forth, and it's just this one shot, and it shows cotton furrows, okay, so agricultural plowing, which is different than what we're seeing in the other areas with the pasture for the cows. A low rise is visible, perhaps mound 7, which is this mound here, or maybe one of these 2 mounds here. But he does take a picture, a photograph, his attempt at creating a panoramic picture, looking eastward across. Okay, and in fact, he labels it panoramic east view. So we have mounds 4, 3, 2, and 1. Right, and you can see the long fence line running across there, the cows on the other side of the fence. You can even see windblown debris there pushed up against the base of the fence. And you can see the tenant buildings and so forth on top of mound 1 as well. So in 1949, we can see that the mounds were all intact and visible on the landscape. The central area of the mounds was fenced in with grazing cattle within it, and some area to the south outside of that central area was used for cotton agriculture. So the other end, the other bookend, 1974, Frank Schambach, who was the station archaeologist in Magnolia at the time, he visited the site. He took photographs of what he described as the last 3 surviving mounds. This is in his daily logs. So the 3 large mounds are 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so he's standing out here somewhere, moving through. He's probably not on a tripod. He's probably walking through and taking shots as he's going through the site. Okay. So the first photo is a north view outside here of mound 1, and the important thing about that is that the tenant house on top of mound 1 is no longer there. Okay. And then we have mound 2 looking south with mound 1 again, and then this position of all 3 of the mounds that Frank said were left at the site at that time. Okay. But in the second one here, you can see that the fields are in fallow. Both of them, you can see the fields are in fallow, but you can see corn stubble and so forth. And so you don't see any cattle in any of the photographs. You don't see any fences in any of the photographs. So the assumption is that that when we compare the 1949 images to the 1974 images, 3 conclusions can be made. The first is this change in landscape use from cattle pasture within the central mound group and cotton agriculture around it to corn agriculture by the 1970s. It's also apparent, as I mentioned, that the tenant occupation is gone. Okay. And then, as I noted, by 1974, Frank mentions that only 3 of the 8 mounds were still visible on the surface. Okay, quite prominently too. Okay. All right. So when we compare then the 1950 map and we overlay that to Google Earth images using the Google Earth historical imagery tool, the integrity of the landscape, the current landscape or recent landscape, can be evaluated. So it's clear that since 1974, mounds 2 and 3 are gone. So here's mound 2 and mound 3. And if we look at them with the mound map removed, all we have are these soil stains, these circular stains in the landscape. So they're gone. Okay. Though at least not visible. Okay. It seems that only mound 1 down here is potentially there, covered in the trees. Okay. And then there's these outlier mounds, mound 5 over here and mound 10, which may or may not be there in the trees or not. Okay. So then the question, has the site lost? So it has been impacted heavily, but has it lost all of its interpretive integrity? The former locations of the mounds clearly responds to these circular soil stainings visible in the Google Earth imagery. So as I already pointed out, 2 and 3, but then we have, this is mound 4 here, and you can see another one here, a small mound, another one there, a small mound, right? So in terms of the mound locations, we can deduce where they were located based on the soil staining. And a small surface collection was done by David Jean in January of 2000, 20 years ago now. But his surface collection revealed that artifacts are still distributed across the landscape. So in a single visit, he collected prehistoric stuff. I've got some lithics there, but there's also some sherds, really sherdlets, stuff that's been plowed up, right? That's not pictured. And a bunch of historic artifacts. So some glass and some ceramics and some iron bits and pieces, this cool little button here that he found, okay? So it's clear that there is some landscape integrity with possible sub-mound surface features and artifact concentrations. So, with permission to get onto the landscape, with landowner permission, a systematic program of surface collection along with remote sensing survey can help confirm the location of these mounds, and could also help define the extent of the activity areas for the tenant farming location as well, which is now another component, another archaeological component to this particular landscape, in addition to the Caddo component. Okay. So this leads me to the next case study, in where I used historical imagery, historical landscape imagery, to help guide interpretations where I was able to collect remote sensing data. Okay. And that's another Red River site called Battle Mound. Okay. It's a single mound site, or at least that's how it's recorded. A single mound site. The most prominent feature is a large multi-platform mound sitting out in the middle of a field. Okay. The first documented digging on the site is in 1911 with Clarence B. Moore, C.B. Moore. Okay. And he mentioned the presence of 4 low humps and rises that, quote, long cultivation evidently had considerably spread. Okay. So 2 primary questions drove the use of historical imagery at Battle with, again, regard to interpreting the remote sensing data. First, were these humps and rises described by Moore, were they former mounds? And if so, where might they have been located? Okay. We know from archaeological evidence elsewhere that along these Red River or floodplain sites, I should say, the Caddo built their structures on low rises. Okay. So presumably there might be a correlation with structures and topography, or what remained of topography, these low humps and rises. And then related to that, are there other landscape features that Moore didn't document that might be related to the construction of these mounds or just Caddo in general? Okay. And second, there is evidence of tenant farming occupation, many photos that I'll show you here in a minute. So I was interested in understanding the distribution of this occupation and its impact on the visibility of the Caddo archaeological record, again, as it's related to the use of remote sensing. Okay, so much like Bowman, there are historical images that document a landscape use in the late 1940s to the early 1950s, focused on cotton farming and cattle pasture. So you can clearly see 1949, Glenn Martin, another collector, these massive cotton furrows, okay, the Battle Mound off there in the distance. And then the image on the top right there shows the cotton going right up to the edge of the mound in a fencing area. And look at the cows are on the other side of the fence, which happens to be the mound itself. So the cattle are grazing on the mound, okay? And Lynn Howard here, who excavated in 1948, he was fascinated with the cows up close for some reason and took a couple pictures, okay? So we can see some evidence of the cows themselves. So there's clearly a history of landscape use that has the potential to impact the archaeological remains and reduce mound visibility through plowing, never mind the destruction of cattle. So today the site is in pasture. They no longer grow cotton, and the cows are restricted from climbing on the mound, or at least in principle, that's the goal. Everybody who works on sites with cows know that they do what they want to do. So you can see here on the right, it's disked. So it's still plow, but it's a low impact form of plowing. They disk the site in the fall to plant winter wheat and let the cows go out on the property in the winter to graze, okay? So there's still some impact to the site with the disking, and as I mentioned, the cows and their curiosity and their kind of destructive nature of them, especially when there's a lot of them around, okay? Oh, I forgot that I put this in here. So, and when it rains out at the site turns into this muddy mix of suck your boot clay and horse manure. I'm sorry, cow manure, okay? And so you can see me standing in it, right? So I'll save that for another talk, right? But that's what the site looks like today, or at least in 2008, okay? So In 1980, as part of the Cedar Grove excavations, oblique aerial imagery was taken at Battle. So they're taking imagery of Cedar Grove, and they did this big fly around to Battle and stuck the camera out the window and snapped a bunch of photos. Okay. But in these images, we can see the large tree-covered mound. Okay. I'm out in the middle of the field, and evidence of a large borrow pit to the north. The cows are not visible, but there are these linear spaced, equally spaced lines running along the site, okay, that is perhaps corn agriculture. And even today, not necessarily at Battle Mound, but the neighboring fields, corn is planted. So it's probably related to corn agriculture at that time in 1980. But there's lots of examples of soil staining that correspond to historical activity. So we have this old road that I've labeled that goes out. There was a corral out here at the end of the mound for the horses. I keep saying horses, for the cows, okay? But it was hoped that some of these circular features might correspond to Caddo landscape. So a large-scale remote sensing survey was undertaken along with targeted areas of some potential features. One of those areas was located east of the mound and surveyed using magnetic gradiometry as well as ground-penetrating radar. And so here's the results of the mag on the left and the radar on the right. And I've got some pictures here of how this is collected in the field. And I purposely chose this picture on the right here. That's not me collecting, that's a fellow student at the time, part of Dr. Kavami's class. But this red van, old timers at the survey may remember this van. I remember driving this van in the summer, had to turn the heat on full blast so it wouldn't overheat. Hopefully it's not being used anymore. But when we compare the results of the magnetic radiometry and ground penetrating radar to the historic aerial imageries, look at this, a borrow pit, okay? That had since been dried up over the years, okay? So where it was originally assumed that there was only 2 borrow pits, this large one out here to the north and another one that's covered in the trees, but it's visible. Remote sensing survey and the use of historical imagery documented a third undocumented borrow pit. So borrow pits are the result of taking earth from this area and using it to construct mounds. So if the borrow pits are where earth was removed to build mounds, why is this borrow pit located so far away from the big mound? So that was the question. Could these borrow pits be related to these low humps and rises that C.B. Moore documented in 1911? And to test this, as well as test a lot of other things, but in order to test this, a large area was surveyed between, there's the borrow pit there, the newly documented, and the mound. So surveyed using, over several years, using magnetic gradiometry. And the results reveal 2 locations that contain evidence of the former remains of Caddo circular structures. So we have this one area here that's located a few meters east of the mound. So we have 4 structures, 1, 2, 3, and 4, okay? And then we have another area over here, a little further, but closer to this borrow pit, where there's at least 2 circular structures that were documented, okay? So as I said, the Caddo were known for constructing structures, circular structures, on top of summits of low mounds. And these 2 areas are interpreted as 2 of the 4 low rises described by Moore in 1911. And today, the locations are hardly recognizable. The topography is hardly recognizable. One has to get the vantage point of literally laying down on the ground in that clay manure mix and looking at that angle only a couple centimeters off the ground to see them, okay? Reduced by years of agricultural applications, hundreds of years over the landscape, beginning as early as C.B. Moore making his note of cultivation had long spread. So the use of historical imagery has guided remote sensing survey locations which identified some of these Caddo features. So the second question was related to the tenant farming occupation and its impact on the visibility of the remote sensing data. So we have these photographs from 1948, show the presence of numerous buildings, fences, outbuildings, and they're all related to a gentleman by the name of Richard Marshall. He was an African-American tenant farmer. We know his name because when Lynn Howard excavated there in 1948, all of his labor was from the African-American tenant farmers there and the surrounding area. And he noted this in his logbook. And so he recorded that Richard Marshall lived on that property. So we have his name, which is kind of cool. So we've got these great photos. Now, the use of magnetic gradiometry is highly sensitive to metal debris. And in this area, because it's historic occupation, their metal sensitivity was quite high. And all this speckling that you see here, that's all metal debris, okay? And it dissipates, it goes away as you move further out from the mound, and you can see kind of some patterning and some linear lines and so forth, right? So the subsurface is littered with metallic debris. And, you know, remote sensing is like a Rorschach test. You got to stare at it, move it, and look for these patterns. But once you work through all that, you can then, in this instance, look at these patterns, compare them to the historic imagery, and to interpret the extent and the distribution of this occupation. And there was surface collection that was done there as well in the 1970s and the 1990s. David Kelly, David Jean, John Miller, they all did surface collection out at the site, systematic surface collection. So we know where the areas in which these artifacts were collected. And so we've got some cool things like there's a doorknob here, there's a buckle, there's a mouth harp, a little pipe stem, some personal items, some additional personal items such as a comb and a little button here, a bunch of different types of glassware and bottles and ceramics and things like that, okay? So here's the cool thing about this though, is that the purpose of taking the photographs in 1948 was not to take a picture of the tenant farm. I mean, I can't say that for certain in Lynn Howard's mind, but I would imagine he considered them an eyesore, right? He was not taking a picture of the tenant farm. It just happened to be there and it was in the way. His goal was to take a picture of the mound, okay? He was there to excavate and document the Caddo occupation. So, but that's the thing. These photographs that he took provide insight into features on the landscape that were not considered archaeological at all when he took these photos in 1948, but they're now part of the archaeological record and landscape at Battle Mound, and none of the buildings exist anymore. So now we have this multi-layering, again, of the archaeological record informed by these historic images. Okay, zipping along here to our third case study, Camp Halsey. Camp Halsey was a civilian conservation corps camp located in northern Faulkner County. Young men from around the state and some from the neighboring states occupied the landscape on two different occasions. The first was as Company 1706 from October 1934 to November 1936, and then again as Company 4748 from October 1937 to April 1939. So we've got an approximately 11-month window between those two occupations when it was not occupied, but the buildings remained standing during that middle abandonment. But by the final abandonment in April 1939, all of the standing structures, the wooden buildings, they were removed, okay? And what remains today, there's several concrete slabs. There's a pretty elaborate gray water and sewer water management system. There's a couple partial chimneys. There's a stone message board that sits right out in the middle of the field. Some of y'all went out there in May. A lot of the station archaeologists came out. I don't know, 5 or 6 of y'all. Mel was out there, state archaeologist, and got to see some of this stuff firsthand. So there's not a lot out there in terms of standing features, okay? Now, the purpose of the camp and all these camps, many of these camps, was to train enrollees in a wide variety of soil conservation, erosion control, and forestry. So they did terracing work, They did gully control, they planted trees, they seeded fields, they did stream and bank protection and so forth. So upon beginning this research, I had these two questions in mind. What was the distribution and arrangement of the buildings? Okay, how are they organized? Okay, and what types of buildings were present there? Okay, so that's kind of a twofold question, a two-scalar question. How are they organized and what types of buildings? And the second was, how has the landscape been used since it was abandoned in 1939? Okay. So one way to evaluate the distribution and arrangement of the buildings is through the use of historical imagery, specifically Soil Conservation Service aerial imagery. So I've got this image from February 1937, graciously shared to me by the guys at Flat Earth Archeology, okay? And only after this is in February 1937, only 3 months after the site was abandoned, about 3 months, okay? During that middle period, okay? And the overall arrangement of the camp, the number and positioning of the buildings of various sizes, the location of a road that runs through the camp here, and you can see all the terracing and so forth that they constructed. Today, the landscape is a horse pasture, essentially, where the locations, as I mentioned, of the former buildings are if they're temporary, they're not there, or if they were on slab, many of them are covered in the vegetation, okay? So I got an image here of some, image here of some students collecting electrical resistivity, and so you get an idea of the landscape, and we always have horses coming up and visiting us and wanting to know what the hell we're doing, okay? So in order to properly compare the 1937 historic soil conservation imagery with the current landscape, a low altitude drone images were collected at an altitude of about 300 feet, okay? Images were stitched together to make this mosaic of the current site landform and the distribution of the current vegetation features. So we can clearly see the terracing, right, still visible today. We can see the former location of the road that runs down, turns its corner, and around this cluster of juniper and cedar trees, depending on where you're from, whether you're cedar or juniper, right? Okay. And when we overlay the two images using a GIS, combine them, a fairly clear picture of the arrangement of buildings in the current landscape can be evaluated. So we've got this long row of 6 buildings that runs along Front Street, the former road. Okay. And in today, these are all situated in an open pasture. And then we have another group of 5 buildings along the north side. And today they're all pretty much located in the snake and tick infested woods. Okay. And then we've got several additional buildings off to the east here that run perpendicular to those other buildings. So we can look at the distribution of the buildings. But in terms of what types of buildings, what do those boxes represent? Several historic images have helped. I'm just going to highlight 2 of those here. The first one here, image A, okay? It's a photograph taken in 1934. It's described in the archival records as, quote, Front Street at Camp Halsey, looking west, 35 CCC enrollees housed per barracks, okay? So using this aerial imagery, the position of the photographer can be established right here as A, and informs on the types of buildings that represent these 6 buildings along Front Street, all of these barracks. So we have the visual evidence of the barracks, plus the archival evidence that talks about 35 CCC enrollees housed in these barracks. An additional covered structure over here that I've zoomed in on is visible. It's currently interpreted as a pump station, a gas pump station, a fuel station, a petro station, because it looks, not only is it on the road here, but it looks to contain a glass top gas pump. And to give you an idea, I just grabbed this off the internet, right? This is what they looked like of the time. We haven't surveyed, we haven't done any work in that area. Presumably there's a tank buried there. Remote sensing will certainly find that, but we just haven't got there yet, unless they pulled it, okay? Now to test this, test the location of the barracks, UCA student Jake Madel in 2019, he tested this. He presented his research at the society meeting in Hot Springs in 2019. Maybe some of you might remember that. He dug 35 shovel tests and found nails and glass that correspond to the location of the barracks, as well as concentrations of shale. And we know from the camp descriptions that shale was used to create walking pathways throughout the camp. So we've got shale concentrations, or maybe pathways were cutting through between the barracks. And these are some of the artifacts that he collected. And then using his initial assessments, we've begun a program of systematic metal detecting. So we've delineated these 10 by 10 meter grids that correspond to the larger site grid in the remote sensing survey areas. And artifacts that are identified are flagged. They're mapped in order to better understand the relationship between the current landscape and the past landscape. So we've got this one grid, two grids actually. So we've got some nails and some wire, and bolts is plural, but there's just one bolt there, okay? And when we then put this over the top of the historic aerial imagery and this overlay, these concentrations of nails, wires, and bolts directly correspond to the location of these former buildings, okay? So it's pretty cool. A second image, also taken in 1934, is 11 individuals standing in front of an office building. We know it's an office building because it says right there, office, okay? There's a screened-in porch, a small chimney attached to the building. There's also a perpendicular building over these guys' shoulders here. Given its perpendicular arrangement to the office, it's interpreted that the position of the photographer is where I've noted B here, facing this way, this building here, and you can see barrack number 6. Those are just arbitrarily numbered, but barrack number 6 over the shoulder of the photo, okay? And beginning in 2019, and again this May 2021, underneath the trees over in here is a stone slab and the base of a former chimney, right? So these were tested as being the location of the office building. So the large slab was exposed. You can see that here. There's an excavation unit that was put outside where we assume the front door to be. And guess what the students found? They found a door hinge, they found a door spring, and of course they found lots of nails, okay? And then the chimney base was also exposed and documented. And the cool thing about that, apart from the chimney base in itself, was found within the hearth, or next to the hearth, was a 10-cent CCC camp token pictured there. And I actually did a artifact of the month write-up on this last year. So you can go out to the surveys page and read more about this camp token. So we've got the historical image of Front Street, and we've got the historic images of these terrestrial base, right? And so they've guided our data collection in terms of the distribution and types of buildings that are present at Camp Halsey. So that leads to the second question of how the landscape's been used since 1939 when it was fully abandoned. It's very clear when we, I don't have it here, but from a previous slide, when we look at the 1937 aerial imagery and the 2021 drone imagery, that much of the landscape is still intact. So the terracing and so forth has not been flattened by plowing. And we know from the landowners and discussions with them that the landscape's been used for grazing of horses. So apart from the overgrowth around the site, which is, there's quite a bit, many of the subsurface features are likely still intact if subsurface features still exist. But it's also been used by the family over the years as a landscape to make memories, okay? So we have these two photos here taken in 1937 when the camp, between its occupied time, of Fay and Maud Blythe. The Blythe family are cousins to the Halsey family. They've been living out there forever. They got roads named after them and everything, right? So it's clear here that these two women are having a fun day, trying to build a snowman on a sunny day, probably after a snowstorm, and the sun comes out and they're out there playing in the snow. So they're first out here. You can see the barracks, you can see the water tower, right? And then they move over and get a kind of a posed picture of them in front of the recreation hall chimney, which has a hearth on the outside and there's a hearth on the inside, right? The building no longer stands, but the chimney is still there, okay? I always wish I knew who was taking these pictures. They didn't record that information, okay? But current memories as well. This is a picture here of Janice Halsey. She's the landowner. She's cousin to the Marianne and Larry Halsey, who occupy the site, or Marianne now, who occupy the site. And she's not been able to go out there and visit the site in many years because she's mobility impaired. So we loaded her up in the buggy, and Lanita and I, and we drove around the site, where she just would not stop talking in a very good way about her experiences and memories of the landscape, right? And bringing those things back to life, okay? So enjoying this landscape. So another way that we can look at the landscape and how it's being used since abandonment is a landscape of pedagogy. And I've already alluded to this, this field school that goes on there. So beginning in 2018, with a little hiatus there for a little COVID hiatus in 2020. But we've had 3 field seasons out there in partnership with the Faulkner County Museum and full support of the Halsey family. We've had great groups of students, and the students have learned so much more about the site than I've had time to kind of present here. But I want to close by coming full circle to the idea that I alluded to in the beginning of the presentation. If we share and use images from the past as part of current research, do they again become active? Do they become part of the present and imbued with these new meanings? And I would argue certainly that is the case, right? We have this great picture here of Fay and Maud Blythe posing in front of the recreation hall chimney, right? And then we have students from this last May, Aislinn and Ashley. They had cleared the base of the chimney here and documented the kind of the pedestal out in front of it, and documented the inside of the exterior hearth. And they were having a blast with the picture on their phone, trying to pose perfectly and recreate this particular image, right? So we have the use of historical imagery. It's allowed the archaeology students to make these tangible and visible connections to the past, and to reintroduce these images into the present, where of course now they contain these new meanings and new experiences that are all linked together based on a particular landscape. Okay, so that's what I got. Okay, I'm going to stop talking there because I need a drink of water.
Okay. Thank you very much, Duncan.
Yeah. I'm open to any questions. I know we're right at the marker on time, but I got nowhere to go.
It's okay. I don't know how to stop your
Oh, I'll do that.
screen. Okay, thank you. That way we could see each other. But Duncan, you're great. I've always loved every talk you've ever given, and I look forward to your talk at the annual meeting. But yes, let's open up everything to everybody for questions.
Drum roll, please. I have a question. Does anybody remember driving in that old red van?
Yes.
That thing was
Yes, I do.
But luckily it is gone, long gone.
Okay, good. Yeah. it was great for me as a graduate student to have the opportunity to use a vehicle and drive 5 hours, but boy, I never knew if I was going to make it.
I know.
Was it a partner of that old red truck that I tried to drive as a grad student, but the wires had been chewed out of by squirrels?
Maybe, yeah. I don't remember.
Could be. Well, I think Duncan, that how you tie stuff in and bring like images into what we know archaeologically and historically. And I think that's a wonderful thing, Duncan.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoy the blending of using archival information. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
not a historic archaeologist by trade. I mean, I'm a cattle archaeologist, but now with this field
Right.
school, I'm delving into that and I'm really enjoying it, you know,
Yeah.
and what that has to offer. And some of the things, part of Camp Halsey, I'm going through a bunch of old newsletters and so forth. And you read these newsletters and it's just kind of like, it's making that space more active at a personal level, and which is kind of fun, some of the stuff. And you really get an idea of how different 1930s were to today. I mean, that's obviously the case, but when
Right.
you read it in terms of people's annotations and even some of the humors and the jokes that they put in these news letters and so forth, you're just kind of like, wow, that's not really appropriate, you know, those kinds of things, right? But it's just it's another past society, so it's cool.
Right. So I want to say that Ginger Parker said, that was fabulous. Thank you so much
You're
for a
welcome.
great presentation.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. Any questions?
I
Oh,
hear
come on.
crickets. They're
I
outside.
I don't have a question, but I agree with Marilyn. I'll say, trying to situate those particular mounds from various old photos can be difficult because the mounds in a photograph are not that tall and they're
Mm-mm.
usually covered with trees. So you have
Mhm.
kind of a little rise with lots of trees, and they're off in the distance, so they're kind of small. So it can be really tricky. I commend you there for getting the fence lines and the cows versus cotton field and that sort of thing. It is tricky.
It's a challenge, and that's the beauty of digitizing them and making them available that you can zoom in, and then you start looking at, okay, this tree branch is similar to that tree branch, but from a different angle. So therefore I'm looking at the other side. And so you have to make those assertions and assumptions based on the orientation of the trees. The tenant farming helps, right? But
Yeah.
sometimes those aren't there.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Any more comments? Questions?
Well, I thank you all for listening to me ramble on here. And I know that Marilyn will probably say this as well, but I hope to see you guys all at the meeting in a few months here on the UCA campus. Take you
Yes.
around the University of Central Arkansas, show you around Conway a little bit. And it's in the fall, so you won't melt as much. But so I hope to see you guys there.
Thank you, Duncan.
You're very welcome.